Hello. So I wasn't sure what I was doing this week. I'm still having some issues with non-YouTube life things, and I'm having a hard time working on this. I was just willy-nilly picking things to search for because the story I'm working on is taking a while to read my research docs. At one point, you were going to get Thanksgiving traditions, Thanksgiving tips from the early 1900s, and then I went a little off the rails and searched for Thanksgiving murder. Yikes, TMN, you creeper. Yeah, well, it brought me to today's story, don't you know? Let me just state right here, we know how news is. I have dates and numbers which are all over the place. Hopefully I have them at least close to being correct-ish. Now, I've heard of Folsom Prison, mainly really just from the Johnny Cash song Folsom Prison Blues, and he did 2 performances at the actual prison. But I did not know much else. It's had quite an interesting past, and I'm going to talk about one particular instance. Thanksgiving, November 24th, 1927. For 20 hours, 1,200 or so prisoners went against authorities and rioted. Before Thanksgiving lunch? I guess they wouldn't have rioted after lunch. Tryptophan would have knocked them out on their butts. But when the dust settled, when prisoners finally surrendered, 13 men would lay dead, and approximately 26 others were injured. After it was over, the majority of the prisoners were returned to their cells, and Warden Court Smith declared that things would go back to a normal routine as soon as they could. Prisoners nervously watched as guards went up and down the cell rows to check off each man, verifying that none were hiding somewhere. But while those prisoners went back under the guise of peace, 6 ringleaders were identified as the ones who started the mass prison break attempt. Those individuals were put into solitary confinement, which apparently is known as the dungeon. From what I read, this so-called dungeon is actually ordinary cells but have no artificial light like the other cells have. The weapons used were 1 gun and half a dozen knives amongst all of the participating prisoners. The prison was eventually surrounded by hundreds of militiamen called to action by the governor, armed with rifles and machine guns and even tanks. Warden Smith had been in his cottage when he had been called by the prisoners originally. They wanted immunity. So, how did this all start? Before lunchtime Thanksgiving Day, prisoners were assembled in the prison schoolroom to watch a movie called Ankles Preferred, which apparently was the holiday movie choice. The ringleaders headed to the main entrance of their cell block to try to seize the outer gate keys. The guards were caught off guard. Assistant turnkey RAY Singleton would hold them off, refusing to give them what they wanted and wrecking their plans to gain their freedom. Unfortunately, his bravery in going against the prisoners would cost him his life. He was killed by the prisoners because he messed up their plans. He prevented them from getting keys to the outside gates of the prison, which would have allowed them to run to their freedom after they had overpowered the on-duty guards. Ray was stabbed, and as they lay there helpless, the prisoners kicked him and trampled him until he was crushed and died. 3 guards were injured at this point of the story: Charles Goranson, Barnett Hughes, and Walter Neal. Because Singleton kept them from getting out, the prisoners went back to the cell block and closed the doors, barricading themselves, and they took 5 guards prisoners. Warden Smith would later say that he believed that this riot had been planned for months. Quote, "There had been indications for months that something of the sort would be attempted. One by one, bits of trouble showed me which way the wind was blowing. Tips given by prisoners restored to liberty put us on the alert. Other tips from inside the prison prepared us. The plot must have been worked out in general form months ago. Each day added details. And Thanksgiving Day, when we allow prisoners a certain latitude, when discipline yields a little to the spirit of the day, was set as the time. I was sitting in my office about 11 a.m. Thursday. The telephone rang. A young convict, never mind his name, was on the line. If the prisoners learned his name, they would murder him. The young convict told me that they were starting a riot and to get ready. I notified the captain of the guard to close the gates and have every one of his men stand by. Then I put in a call for Sacramento. I wanted police help. From all I had learned of the plot, the leaders would stop at nothing. I also appealed to the sheriffs of nearby counties and police of surrounding towns. I stuck by the telephone, gambling on a hunch I had played Wednesday. I changed turnkeys. The man on duty at the door leading from the cell block did not have the keys to the door. I did not see the actual shooting, but the courage of the guards who turned back the first assault was admirable. The weapons had apparently been smuggled in the prison over a period of months. The convicts wanted to get me at the point of those pistols and with me, as a shield, march out the main gate. Fortunately for the state of California, this plan did not succeed. It is difficult to imagine what would have happened had this horde of convicts been liberated." End quote. Governor Young called the state militia and gathered a force together. The militia would shoot at the building. Apparently some 200 shots were exchanged. A handful of convicts were killed right away. 17 wounded initially before 5 more would pass away from their injuries. During the night, Warden Smith would escape from his office. One of the captured guards was tossed from a window, critically injured. Charles Gillespie, aged guard, would pass away seemingly from natural causes. A convict dropped a note from the second-story window, retrieved by guard Ed Bathurst, with a message that read, quote, "Ammunition almost gone," end quote. Captain Larkin would send back a note that stated, quote, "You may come out now in the customary order and everything will be all right," end quote. A response note came back from the convicts. "We don't know what it said, but we can surmise they weren't going to give up because more terror bombs were sent in." The prisoners wanted immunity. Warden Smith would tell them, quote, "You will all be given a fair trial under the laws of California. You know that any promise of immunity which I might make would be worthless because I have no such power. I want you boys to surrender quietly. I am greatly grieved over this whole mess, and I guess you boys are too," end quote. Warden Smith would explain, quote, "We opened negotiations at 6:15 a.m. This would be the next morning after the riot started. One of the prisoners inside the cell block telephoned me saying he would like to speak on behalf of the ringleaders of the revolt. We want to open peace negotiations in order to prevent innocent prisoners from being killed in this battle." Then he hung up the receiver. 6:35, someone telephoned me again. This time it was apparently a well-educated man who talked calmly and sensibly about the whole affair. He asked if the prisoners surrendered, could they be assured that they would not be beaten or manhandled? I told him I would guarantee there would be no rough play. Then he wanted me to promise none of the men would be hanged for the murder of Singleton. I replied that it would be ridiculous to make such a promise, for it would not hold in court. He agreed. Next, he inquired, would the ringleaders be placed in solitary and starved for their deeds? I told him just what I planned to do. Put them in solitary and limit them to 1 square meal a day. No bread and water, I said. All right, Warden, that sounds reasonable. I asked to talk to one of the ringleaders personally. After a while, I heard a convict's voice that sounded mighty familiar. "This is Tony Brown, isn't it?" I asked. He refused to reply. Then the speaker requested me to repeat everything I had previously promised to the well-educated speaker. I did. He listened attentively and said, "Well, that's okay. I guess that's the best we can do. Send E. Bathurst down and we'll give up our guns and knives." We immediately called Bathurst. He is a brave devil, you know. Bathurst is one of the guards. He risked his life several times last night, going up to the cell house and talking to the men, getting notes and taking all kinds of chances. But before Ed could get down to the place, the prisoners had got so anxious to surrender they had already turned over some of their weapons to Ed Purcell, a guard. He took one long dagger, a razor, I guess that's what killed Singleton, poor chap, a .45 automatic, and a couple of handfuls of ammunition. Nothing else. Purcell delivered the weapons to Bathurst and he brought them to me. That concluded the armistice. Thank God it's all over without any more bloodshed. End quote. Warden Smith entered the cell house alone to speak with the prisoners who were holding now 4 guards as their own prisoners. The guards were fine. Warden would take the aforementioned weapons and the prisoners would follow him out and head to their cells. Deaths, 11 convicts, 2 guards. A note picked up by a United Press correspondent in the prison yard beneath a window of the embattled cell house. Quote, "Warden, please do something else except to kill so many innocent men. Give us a chance. There is no harm to your affairs. We cannot open the door on account of the few whom you want. Signed, Crow. This was written in blue crayon on a large piece of torn white paper. It was evidently thrust out of the charnel house while machine guns of the besiegers were raking the building. Statement of Guard Lawrence Purcell to the United Press after he had been released from a night of captivity. Quote, "They didn't mistreat us. They bound our ankles together with electric light wire, but during the night we sat up or lay down as we chose. It was silent most of the time. We did not feel like talking much, just smoked in silence and wondered how the fearful night would end. We could not hear what the convicts were saying, as they mumbled and whispered to each other and paced the floor nervously." End quote. 4-year-old Emery Campbell Jr. greeted his father, another of the captured guards. Quote, "Daddy, Daddy, where did you been all the night?" End quote. Guard Campbell to the United Press upon his release by the rioting prisoners. Quote, "They stripped us down to our underwear, searched us thoroughly, took our money, and allowed us to dress again. We spent the night in total darkness, in that room with the dead men, the injured, and the well. In the gloom, we could see a number of the leaders keeping a virtual guard over several hundred prisoners, apparently not in sympathy with the jailbreak, who were forced up against the wall. Whenever one of the prisoners scratched a match to smoke or find a place to lie down, he was immediately warned against making a light. I was the only one of the 5 prisoners," he's a guard who was held prisoner, "who was threatened. One of the ringleaders, a small man whom I did not recognize, swore at me and said if I was lucky enough not to get killed that night, I'd sure get it later. We had nothing to eat, but were handed a cup of hot chocolate. Where they got it, I don't know, as they were cut off from access to the mess hall." End quote. The leader would be named as Anthony Brown, age 28, from San Francisco. He'll be charged with assault to commit murder. He was already serving 15 years for robbery. The others would be charged with conspiracy to commit murder. Those 5 are Roy E. Stokes, alias Jack Harrison, 5 years to life for burglary. James Gleason, alias Eugene Crosby, 5 years to life for robbery. Walter E. Burke, alias W.P. Smith, 5 years to life for robbery. Albert M. Stewart, alias Z. Saunders, 14 years and 1 day for forgery. James H. Gregg, alias J. Flynn, life for murder of a constable. All of these murder charges would come with the death penalty. Warden Smith closed the doors to visitors for a week while the investigation goes on to find how Brown could have gotten the pistol. The non-ringleader prisoners had a full ration of food in the mess hall the afternoon the riot ended, but were not served in one big group, as you can imagine. It had taken some time to get the kitchen back up and running. The 6 leaders were questioned at length. Albert Stewart would admit to wounding Walter Neal, turnkey guard, in the leg, but beyond that, nothing much was said. No one would admit to knowing about the death of Ray Singleton, who would actually be horrifically killed. The deaths of 9 convicts are being looked into to see if they were killed by the ringleaders, so incurring additional charges, or killed in the melee. George Baker, convict trustee, who was killed by the ringleader's gun in the back, but it's unknown if it was accidental or intentional. A convict trustee is a prisoner who has a good reputation and is given extra duties. Apparently, when Neal was shot in the leg, a second bullet was fired which missed. Some believe that second shot may have hit Baker. November 29, 1927. The ringleaders will be tried in Sacramento specifically for the death of turnkey Ray Singleton and will be under heavy guard escort, according to District Attorney Neil McAllister. Their preliminary hearing will be before Justice of the Peace John Leonard. An inquest will be held to establish the cause of death of the 13 victims, with the ringleaders appearing as witnesses. December 1st, 1927. The preliminary hearing has been postponed some days to allow the ringleaders to meet with attorneys since they've been held in solitary since their surrender, have not been able to talk to lawyers or arrange for their defenses. Regardless of how you feel about what they did, all have the constitutional right to seek counsel. Stokes, Stewart, and Burke had attorneys in mind. Gregg, Brown, and Gleason will be defended by lawyers appointed by the state. December 2nd, 1927. DA Neil McAllister promises expeditious trials. Quote, "The convicts have delayed proceedings all they can in having the preliminary hearing postponed until Monday." After the hearing, I can promise that the men will face a superior court jury in Sacramento within 2 weeks." End quote. January 16, 1928. Trial begins for the 6 men charged with the first-degree murder of Ray Singleton. State wants the death penalty. Brown and Gleason would plead not guilty, and also not guilty on the grounds of insanity. The others were all just not guilty. If Brown and Gleason are found guilty, they will have to have a second trial to determine their sanity before they would be allowed to be hanged. You cannot hang someone for a crime if they are considered insane. January 19th, 1928. Apparently there will be an adjournment until January 24th to gather up a new jury panel of 100 persons. In other news, the .45 automatic that was in the prisoner's possession was allegedly solved by the arrest of a Mr. Mulryan chauffeur who said that he had bought the gun from the state armory and hid the gun in the prison blacksmith shop somehow so one of the convicts could get access to it. February 9th, 1928. State rested its case. The defense requested a little more time before it presents its side so they could subpoena witnesses. The prosecution in its presentation of their case talked about the prison school building, the tunnel that led to the old cell house where 5 guards were taken prisoner. Those guards were H. McCrary, E.L. Campbell, Charles Dangler, George Purcell, and Antone Masick. Masick was the prison librarian, and he was released the night of the riot while the others remained prisoner until they surrendered. The guards relayed to the court how they were captured while on duty, forced to sit on a bench in the middle of the building while the ringleaders patrolled, led to the door into the prison yard and forced to open it, and then taken into the tunnel that led to the old cell house and held under guard. The guards identified Brown, Stokes, and Burke as the men who had the weapons used in capturing them: a razor, hatchet, gun, and dagger. Guard McCrary said that at surrender they were forced to take an oath that the guards wouldn't testify against the ringleaders. Whoops. Burke was overheard to have complimented Brown on his marksmanship in wounding Barrett Hughes, warden's secretary. Guard Campbell spoke of the ringleaders' plans to force the guards into the prison yard and for the guards to act as a shield to the ringleaders as they made for freedom. But Guard Purcell would tell the ringleaders that would be madness, as the guards on the wall would shoot anyone and everyone to stop them, including the guards. Whether that would have really happened or not, it at least stopped the ringleaders from going through with it. Guards Dangler and Campbell would testify about being threatened with the gun and knife. Guard Purcell would testify to being forced to open the school door and begging those on duty not to shoot. Prison librarian Masick, it was said, would be treated the worst of the prison employees held prisoner. He was hit on the head twice and kicked in the head by Stokes as Masick was lying on the ground. Stokes would be stopped from any further violence by the other ringleaders, thankfully. Ray Singleton, the guard who was killed, was said by Dr. C.H. McDonald, county autopsy physician, to have died from hemorrhage of the heart from a stab wound, among the 9 stab wounds found on his body. 4 were scalp wounds, stab wound to the right arm, deep stab wound high in the center of the chest, and 3 in the left breast. One of those was the killing blow. February 15, 1928. Albert Stewart would earn the nickname the Squealer today. He told the court that Brown was the actual primary instigator of the riot. Prior to Stewart, the other leaders would refuse to identify the knife that killed Singleton. Stewart then got on the stand and wanted to tell all. They would all be given life sentences for the murder of Ray Singleton, which ain't no thing because they were pretty much all serving life sentences anyway. March 26, 1928. Well, we're going to a second trial, this time for the murder of George Baker, convict trustee. Burke and Gregg were determined to represent themselves while the other 4 have lawyers. May 27, 1928. So this is weird, but yes, the second trial for the charge of murder against George Baker got underway and then stopped in its tracks by a sick juror. Now, I don't know what this juror had, but it was said he would be in the hospital for at least a month. So basically, they threw out that jury, had to go for another jury panel, selected those, and now we're back underway. So you're seeing third trial in the headlines. It's because the second overall trial, first trial regarding Baker, had to be tossed. May 29th, 1928. I didn't get much news coverage about this trial either, but basically they were all found guilty. and the verdict carries the death penalty for all of them. Now, what was interesting is that Albert Stewart, aka the Squealer, was thought to only get life in prison, for turning state's evidence. But he too was convicted of first-degree murder with the death penalty, and apparently his fellow ringleaders thought this was hilarious. June 8, 1928. The ringleaders are in the condemned row at the prison waiting for their execution. They are due to be hanged on August 17th. However, a notice of appeal was filed by Albert the Squealer, who represented himself, and J.J. Henderson represented the other 5. Warden Smith, quote, "We shall probably need all the time allowed by the judge in order to hang the 6 men in one day. Due to the limited room in the execution chamber, only one scaffold can be used, so the prisoners must hang one at a time between the hours of 9 a.m. and 6 p.m. The gallows must be tested each time, changing the rope and reinforcing the scaffold, according to the various weights of the prisoners. This will be the first time in the history of Folsom Prison that more than one person has been hanged in one day." End quote. August 16, 1928. The hanging would be deferred with the receipt of the ringleaders' appeals. November 16, 1928. Well, whoops. DA Neil McAllister discovered a mistake in the trial court transcript which could lead to another trial for the ringleaders. So during the jury questioning, Judge Glenn asked potential juror Mr. Dawson what his opinions were on capital punishment. When asked if he had conscientious scruples against capital punishment, he responded, yes. DA McAllister said that if Dawson said he was against it, he should not have been on a jury. Of course, the state would say that because if he was against it, that would be in favor of the defense. So they brought up Mr. Dawson, who said that he had said no to the question, not yes. A review of the court reporter's shorthand notes would show that Dawson had said no. McAllister would file an affidavit from the court reporter to the Supreme Court to correct the trial records, and nothing more seemed to have come of this situation. April 2, 1929. State of California will create a state emergency council for times of state stress, like Folsom Prison riot. 9 members, including state officials and heads of relief organizations, would be appointed by a governor for the council. It would be their duty to make preparedness plans in case of any emergencies. May 1st, 1929. Well, the state Supreme Court denied the appeals of 5 of the 6 ringleaders. They will continue to the gallows. Albert the Squealer's fate has not been decided yet. May 21st, 1929. The 5 convicts filed a petition for a rehearing, blaming woefully insufficient evidence, bias and prejudice of a juror, and the high-in-the-instep Supreme Court misinterpreting the transcript of the case. Sacramento County DA has 8 days to file an answer to the petition, and the Supreme Court must give its decision 2 days later. July 20th, 1929. The 5 condemned to death have been given a bit of a reprieve to allow them time to appeal. They were supposed to be executed next month. October 25th, 1929. 5 of the 6 leaders were sentenced to hang. Nothing happened with the appeals. Brown and Stokes, January 3rd. Burke and Gregg, January 10th. Gleason, January 17th. October 30th, 1929. Well, when you squeal, you put your life on the line. Brown and Burke stormed the prison's hospital, looking for Albert, who they believe is at least partially responsible for their death penalty sentences. Believing him to be in the hospital, the 2 men got away from their guards and tried to enter the hospital ward. A brief battle with the men ensued, but both were caught, although Burke would fracture both arms and Brown would suffer a severe cut on his head. A hospital attendant was cut on the ear by a knife that Burke threw. January 3rd, 1930. Anthony Brown, Roy E. Stokes, and Louis Lazarus, not involved in the riot, were hanged. Anthony was the first, saying to the warden, quote, "All right, warden, let's make it snappy," end quote. 9:02 a.m., the trap sprung. 12 minutes later, he was declared dead. Stokes would follow. 9:27 a.m., the trap would open. 7 minutes later, he was declared dead. Stokes was allegedly the one who stabbed Ray Singleton with a dagger repeatedly. He would not exhibit that kind of bravado, being half carried up to the gallows. and would look at the crowd and state, quote, "My God, Warden, you've got an awful bunch here today," end quote. Before he was put on the gallows, the warden, who apparently is quite tall, and Stokes, who's quite small, Warden would compliment Stokes on a letter Stokes had written to Burke's mother. Burke was to be executed the next week. Quote, "It was a fine thing to do," end quote, the warden said. And Stokes replied, quote, "That's all right. I'm not much of a letter writer, but I wanted her to know that I appreciate what she has done for me," end quote. Now, interestingly, Brown and Stokes would not ask for clemency for themselves, but did for Eugene Crosby, aka Gleason, who they both stated had no part in the murders but was convicted only because he wasn't squealing, like Albert. January 11th, 1930, Walter Burke and James Gregg were hanged for the murder of George Baker. January 17th, 1930, Eugene Crosby, aka Gleason, was hanged for his part in the riots. He spent his last day writing letters and poetry, but like his fellow rioters, did not request a visit from clergy. Showing no sign of fear, his last words were "Good morning" that he said to Guard Captain Clarence Larkin. Sadly, Guard Larkin would lose his life in yet another Folsom riot in 1937. Albert Stewart again had testified against his 5 companions and pleaded to the court to end the suspense he's feeling as to his own fate. He is in appeal pending before the Supreme Court, and while he waits, he's hanging out in the dungeon. The appeal is for leniency to see if that will be granted with regards to a sentence, or will he be forced to carry out the death sentence as is. January 9th, 1931. Albert was resentenced to hang for March 13th, although some believe this will not happen. March 21st, 1931. Albert had his sentence commuted to life imprisonment and was transferred to San Quentin for his own protection. July 27th, 1931. The Wickersham Law Enforcement Commission took a look into the American prison system and submitted its 7th report to President Hoover. Mostly they denounced the prison system. Quote, "The prison has failed as a disciplinary institution. The riots, the fire, the use of cruel and brutal measures of punishment, the persistent recurrence of murder within the prison, the presence of narcotics, the frequent atmosphere of hatred and bitterness are sufficient evidence. It is clear at present that the more punishment in prison, the more discontent. The more discontent, the more irritation. The more irritation, the more plotting. The more plotting, the more violation of rules, and the greater need for more severe punishment. The whole procedure is in the nature of a vicious circle for which there seems to be no remedy." End quote. One of the first remedies it proposed was segregation of the diseased, insane, drug-addicted, and hardened criminals. Quote, "The millions of dollars now employed to construct elaborate maximum security prisons could go with much better advantage, be used in the development and proper financing of adequate systems of probation and parole." End quote. They proposed that prisoners could be paid wages, have more humanized treatment, prison officials would not be chosen under the guise of politics, and guards would be trained for their specific duties. Quote, "Employment adds burden and strain upon both the prison administration and the inmates, which becomes almost intolerable." End quote. Where some were kept in their cells almost 24 hours a day, and others made to sit on benches for most of the day because there was no work. Mentioning the Folsom riots specifically, among other incidents, the commission said that if prisoners were irritated, quote, "then no amount of discipline or cruelty will save the institution from internal violence, riot, fire, and murder." End quote. January 26, 1932. Albert the Squealer still at San Quentin to protect him from angry prisoners at Folsom, but he's been in solitary confinement the whole time and actually wants to go back to Folsom. He told the warden, quote, "I'm no rat. Maybe some of the convicts still think so and will stick a knife in me, but anything is better than this awful solitude. Put me out there. I haven't much to live for anyway. When I get through with a 14-year jolt for forgery, I start on 2 consecutive life sentences. I'm 37 now, and I have been in prison since I was 21. End quote. September 1st, 1933. Albert tried to bluff his way into an escape at San Quentin. He gave a letter to the civilian distribution officer that read Albert had dynamite on his person and he would blow himself and anyone else in the area up if the officer did not put him into the truck. Well, the officer wasn't having it, hit Albert in the jaw, and 2 other prisoners assisted the officer in taking down Albert. The dynamite? Pieces of broom handles wrapped in paper. So that's it for this story. I wish you all well and give my thanks to each and every one of you. Please subscribe if you haven't already. Check out my stories to see what you may have missed. I'm going to take next week off, mainly in hopes that I can get caught up with my actual full-time job, which may be destroying my soul a little bit, and get caught up with my channel, which I adore. See you in a couple of weeks.